Okay, I'm Vince Micah with Kubala-Washotko Architects, and during your lunch I'm going to take you on a journey of what it was like to work on the first Unitarian Society in Madison, Franklin Wright's home church. And here we go. So, how do you add to a Franklin Wright building without subtracting? Therein lies the challenge. First of all, we were asked, we turned it down. They asked again, we turned it down. And then they asked a third time, and then we had enough, I don't know, were we stupid? Were we scared? A little of both. And we took it on, realizing that this design problem is complex, or all designs are complex, but this one is complexer than most. Why is it complex? It's the largest Unitarian Universalist congregation in the United States, 1,400 members, 250 of them are UW professors. There were 32 user groups that we had to interact with. It had State Historical Society easements in place, outspoken Friends of the Meeting House organization, simultaneous ongoing Meeting House restoration, the original building design part of FUS's success, and decided early on not to split the congregation or even go to a different site. That was considered at one point. So on top of this, or maybe behind this, was this guy. Looking over our shoulders. And I share this story with you that the first day that we got a hold of the original drawings, the blueprints, and we unrolled them in our studio, and it was a rainy evening, and at that exact moment when we rolled open the drawings, our roof had a leak, and it dripped right exactly on Franklin Wright's signature on his drawings, and it's almost as if he was saying, "I'm watching you. Be careful." And it's like, okay. So the conditions that we were trying to respect is this amazing meeting house that had this incredible intimate feel to it, where it literally felt you were in your living room having a conversation with others in this very special space. And of course, true to form, the depressed entry with the very low eaves. The eave height was 5 feet 6 inches, but at its furthest out point with a 14.5-foot cantilever, it dipped another 6 inches. And the question was, should we fix that? And you can guess what the answer would be. What would that answer be, Jen? No, that's historic fabric. That's part of the story. So no, that you don't fix that. The classic stone detailing and a lot of punctured openings that were accentuated with the Cherokee red detailing. The B wing that has this stone wall that conceals behind it classrooms this was conceived in 3 different wings: the A wing, the B wing, and the C wing. The A wing was when Franklin Wright was still alive. The B wing was when Wes Peters was beginning to take over and helped complete it, and the C wing was with the Taliesin Associates. This is the C wing that Taliesin Associates did. And the stage was set for potential disaster. The only way out was a clear process, and a process that had to be very transparent enough to be debated. After all, we are working with Unitarians, and they love to debate. So how do we make a process transparent? What we thought was instead of it just being our voice saying, we think this is an appropriate gesture, we brought in Frank Lloyd Wright experts from around the country. Gunny Harbaugh was one of them. He's the restoration architect for the Unity Temple in Oak Park, Illinois, the Rookery in Chicago, and the Reliance Building in Chicago. John Eifler, he's a member of the Frank Lloyd Wright Building Conservancy, Landmark Preservation Council of Illinois, and the restoration architect for Taliesin East and West. And now the late John Thorpe, founding board member and past president of the Frank Lloyd Wright Home and Studio Foundation in Oak Park, Illinois. He's helped restore more than 60 Frank Lloyd Wright buildings. In addition to these distinguished individuals, it was Neil Levine from Harvard University that joined the critique group, Jim Sewell from the State Historical Society, and Ann Biebel and Peter Rote from Isthmus Architects. So this was a long road to get this project from initial idea all the way through completion. Started way back in 2005, and if any of you know TKWA, we use this process called pattern writing, and it's an intentional process where we attempt to listen very carefully to try to find out what are all the issues that need solving, and then through a process of conversation, we come up with a written solution before we ever put a single line on a drawing. So here is 2005 pattern writing. Then you'll see with these gold stars, that's the point of intersection with our peer review group that they checked in with us throughout the process. So master planning is happening in early 2005. Unitarians take off for the summer. They go and commune with nature. And that they restart then again in the fall. So September, the schematic design process continues. That was one of the hottest summers on record in Madison. There was another gold star in there. Our advisory group gave us some feedback. We went through design development. Then during the construction documents, we also got some feedback. And then we constructed it right between 2007 and 2008. So this design process, we needed to discover all of the forces at play. So what does that look like? When we talk about the forces, there's function, there's aspirations, there's the environment, there's geometry, there's history, there's legal, there's climate, there's political, there's peers, there's codes. So you can see that there was a lot of layers that we needed to be mindful of. Then we had to identify recurring conflicts and diagnosis, recognizing the discontinuities that this project had, seek out the problems, rank and order them in issues of scale, create some insight for those, and put some meaning behind some solutions. So when we write patterns, this is sort of the definition of what Christopher Alexander, he is really the author of pattern writing, and we just respect his work immensely and refer to it every day in our work. We wrote 29 patterns, and a pattern will have a title, and they're organized with the really large scale ones first, and then we sift our way through the medium and down to the small scale ones. So we get the large scale pattern figured out first, then the other ones will start to naturally fall into place. So I'm going to share with you just two of the patterns that we came and worked through in this project. So the first one is the new front door. So we start with a problem statement. It then has some discussion issues and a solution statement. So the problem was, with the contemplated addition of between 15 to 20,000 square feet of new facilities, it'll be a challenge to ensure that this campus feels like a single entity with various parts and not the other way around. Then there was some discussion about without a place that acts as a common landmark, wayfinding within the new campus will become compromised. So the solution, establish a place where all paths cross. Make this place adjacent to the new front door. Give it a distinctive character, a strong place on everyone's cognitive map. So then this is, again, some of the description of producing pattern map resolution and some of Christopher Alexander's definition of what that means. So let's start with the existing conditions, and we're trying to find out where could we build an addition. So let's layer on the places that you can't. First, there's setbacks. Then there's historic view corridors. Can't build anything in these areas from what you can see inside the building out. Then there's sacred ground, where cremains are scattered around the grounds. Then there's a building preservation gradient. Starting with the darkest green is the absolute no touch. And as it becomes lighter green, you can have slight manipulation. And as it becomes less green and purple, there's more opportunity for manipulation. So you layer all those together, and you see the few white spots left over of where you could possibly put an addition in the backyard or in the front yard. And now you start to layer over a pattern. The new front door. Give this door clear markings as to its function and importance. Locate the new front door within visual proximity of the historic entrance. And that's a tricky one because you've got several doors to pick from. You've got the main front door, which is the furthest to the right, and then there's the secondary front door, which is at the sort of hinge of the two buildings, and then where the new front door potentially could go in those two other arrows. And they all need to sort of talk to each other. Then there's the community crossing. This pattern says, let's establish a place where all paths cross. Make this place adjacent to the new front door. Give it a distinct character, a strong place on everyone's cognitive map. So one of the things they told us is that they love when all of the children can cross paths with the older members of the congregation, because there's a certain sort of mixing of those two that currently was not happening. And they said, let's find a way that we don't bifurcate our congregation. Let's let them mix and blend and benefit from each other's company. So that put this red blob as, here's the likely good location for this community crossing. So then we obtained feedback from user groups, congregations, peer reviews, and approval bodies. We developed permutations, narrowed the choices, let it gestate over the summer when they're off, and then choose a prime direction. We came up with 5 options with an auditorium, 2 without, and then we had to narrow the choices. And then by voting from the user groups and staff and the development task force, 3 sort of boiled to the top for the with auditorium and 1 without. And then there was the winner that had the highest vote. And then we got advisor feedback. And they said, you're not quite there. You got to keep the peer, got to keep us involved, investigate the potential for retaining the B wing, reduce the impact of the addition on the west residential portion of the site, acknowledge that the car is integral to Frank Lloyd Wright's original design intent. And I tell you, we struggled with that one. We're like, the car has historic context here? because we wanted to put a lot of green space in the center. And it's like, that's when you had to like step back. Yes, it does have historic context here. So pay attention. Don't try to usher it out of the room. And then you got to tread softly on this site. So choose a prime direction. This was the chosen prime direction. And then the fundraising results came back and they were like, we can only afford about half of what you're showing there, so scrap this plan. And let's start to look back at what our peers said. Jim Sewell said, your addition, it obscures part of the B wing. John Thorpe said, the auditorium is too obvious. It's needing to play second fiddle in the whole composition of what's going on here. And the attempts to fix that plan through manipulation, amputation, just didn't meet with success. So we decided to unfold a new design. With the recommendations from the advisory group, we got to break the geometry of the historic meeting house, keep as many green features as possible, stay within budget, because if you're not on budget, you're not going to build anything. Maintain the upper crossing connection to the B wing, and maintain sequence of patterns. So starting with a fresh, clean piece of paper, we looked at this intersection that occurred at the end of the B wing and this 60-degree angle. And then there was the lower X, that was where the minister's office was. And that became a sort of arc point of how we are beginning to establish a new geometry. The higher X point, that is the podium in the meeting house. And every gesture that we were looking to do is the bones of this building needs to focus back on the historic building. So now you've got this compound curve starting to happen, and it's creating this natural response and almost genuflex back to the historic meeting house. Behind this line, or this compound curve, could the new addition exist? These yellow lines say that at every point, you have an opportunity to look back to the historic structure. So the new auditorium resides in this area. We had a delicate connection to the B wing. We call it the hyphen. And the historic folks in the room know exactly what I'm saying when I say you have to have a hyphen between your two buildings. You have to have a simple foil to the A wing, positive space between the A and the new geometric focus of the A wing. The A wing is always in view along the crossing, and the crossing veils the mass of the new auditorium. So this upper level plan, what we ended up doing was we took a cue from the B wing, and most of it was subterranean, and it was concealed beneath a low wall. Because of the way this topography worked, it dropped off naturally towards this side of the site. And so we only have the ability to enter the building, experience the balcony from that upper level, and have a connection back to the B wing. On the lower level, that's where all of the addition resided, with the new auditorium and all of the support spaces around it with music rehearsal and kitchen and meeting rooms and bathrooms and elevators and all the other stuff. So when you look at this in sort of a sense of the shape that this roof creates as it swoops up high towards the meeting house on the right side, and it swoops down low, but yet still has a gentle little kick up. There's sort of, those two are talking to each other. And they're saying that we are related to one another, but we know where our place is in terms of importance of on this site. So here you can see in the section that the majority of this addition is tucked down low, and you don't see that large mass. It doesn't compete for visual space as you see it and perceive it as you first experience it as you approach it on site. So here you see a little bit of an aerial view of how we tucked in, and we had to create our own views because we were looking at the backs of buildings where they had dumpsters, mechanical units, stormwater, and everything that was ugly for all the other buildings, and we had nothing to look at, so we had to create our own garden space or our own views. And we intentionally masked out seeing any cars from the new auditorium, so you're down low enough. And here you can see how that begins to mask the ugly from the view of the auditorium. And so here you can see that this curved structure always is pointing itself back to the historic meeting house. And inside the auditorium, this roof structure almost had a musical instrument type of feel to it, where it's a very delicate, highly tuned camber where we could dial in the camber of each one of those beams plus or minus a 1/16 of an inch, and yet a very delicate expression of its structure and honest. All of the structure is exposed and becomes a part of the vocabulary. So a little further rendered, and then what it looks like in reality. We worked with Findorff, and I remember they were just experimenting with total station at that time, and it was really a game changer to get a building to lay out where you're just using GIS mapping and everything could lay this building out with all these compound curves, and to have closure at the end of it within a 1/4 inch was pretty amazing. And I remember the guys bending over this, and they kept cranking the forms to get the right amount of curve in those forms so that one curve is tangent with the next curve, and it has this smooth transition. And you can see just behind this guy's butt the opening that we're about to make into the B wing, where the stone has been removed, and that's going to try to slide our addition, our hyphen, to connect right at that point. So an aerial view of how the two talk to each other today. So they also had a lot of goals in terms of sustainable strategies. This was doesn't sound like much of a thing now, but that was the first LEED Gold church in the entire state of Wisconsin. So they were very invested in making sure that all things sustainable are high on the agenda. These were the typical features that they were the best thing. If anybody asks you what's the most sustainable thing you can do, either save a building or build a new building, save a building is always one of the most sustainable things you can do, because there's this thing called embodied energy. And it took a certain amount of energy, carbon that was spent to harvest the materials from the earth, to manufacture them, to transport them, and then to erect them. And to not re-spend that carbon, save that, and then just renovate or remodel that building, that's a very highly sustainable thing to do. They're connected to public transportation. We had the biggest bike parking lot that I've ever done for a church. We're able to park 80 bikes at this place. It was crazy. And we had barely enough parking on paper that most zoning administrators would say that doesn't work. And I'm like, you don't know the Unitarians. It does work for them because they do everything that they can to try to lessen their carbon footprint, and that includes public transportation, bikes, walking. They had some stormwater issues. They were regularly flooding their neighbors' basements because every bit of stormwater ran off to this side of the site, and they always got the complaining phone calls. So we had to correct that. When we were done, with all the green roofs and the rainwater gardens and the various capture points, we have not a gallon of water leaves that site with this new stormwater management system. And part of that is the green roofs. This green roof is really wonderful. It changes colors 4 times in the year. And I think it's great to see a building change its colors. It's sort of, you see the cycles of spring, summer, fall, and in winter. It's really a delight to see those color changes. Waterless urinals, optimizing energy performance. This is 16 years ago, so we're so far beyond this, but looking back at that, it was pretty amazing for what they accomplished back then. We did geothermal, and we geothermally heated and cooled, and we were trying to geothermal cool the floor. And that's not easy to do because you have to have the exact right conditions, because if you don't have the right indoor relative humidity, and if you cool it too cold, you could have condensation issues. So we avoided that one and we abandoned that idea. It was on the docket, but it just didn't quite work out. We're maximizing indoor fresh air quality, introducing a lot of natural assist ventilation, a well-insulated building, daylighting in 75% of the spaces, innovation for green education. They do lots of tours. And here's that space that Masted's view of the parking lot, the music rehearsal spaces, the crossing space where the kids from classrooms intersect with the adults of the congregation. The upper crossing. You can see the historic buildings through the windows. From the balcony area, looking down towards the lower level of the auditorium. And there it exists in connection with the existing historic buildings. There's that hyphen that we gently touch the historic B wing on the right with the Bermuda copper roof, and then the new addition to the left, in the glass roof in that area, the green roof. Frank Lloyd Wright, when he first designed the meeting house, and the first time the choir performed in the meeting house, the acoustics weren't great. It wasn't projecting out into the congregation the way they liked, and so later on they added a foil above the choir area so that that sound could project better. We learned from that, and from day one we made certain that the acoustics were very dialed into this space, both for the spoken word, the sung, and also musicians in this space. There's varying degrees of absorptiveness and reflectiveness in the walls, and even at night, how it turns itself into a very transparent building where you can see right through it and into the auditorium. And so, an architect, Andrew Maynard, did a piece recently on this, and I thought I'd just share with you what his thoughts were in walking through this building.
Could you imagine how intimidating and impossible it would be to add an extension to one of our most important modern buildings? And they have smashed it. This is an extraordinary, thoughtful extension.
Frank Lloyd Wright's Unitarian meeting house across the road. So this addition is by Kabbalah Washako about 10 years ago.
How good is it? It's like Frank Lloyd Wright meets Alto. Bit of vibe here. It's related because of the timber structure that's on display, but it's not Frank Lloyd Wright.
It's one of how the structural logic from the outside goes inside, and then the glazing just goes on the other side of it and is expressed with the same Cherokee red as Frank Lloyd Wright.
All of the steel structure is painted white, including the bolts. And then where you get this structural shift twice, that column is steel to deal with the extra load. So it's painted white. And then that comes across and you've got all of these timber posts, and the steel one is then white.
And I think all the steel things are white as well. Look at these brackets.
Timber battens going through, and then the double glazing just slides up through it.
Oh, yeah.
Which is a legacy of the Usonian school of thinking. It's great how they've put that sort of baffled wall through there. You get borrowed landscape, but you don't see all of the solar panels and the junk on the back. It's very thoughtful.
Wonderful details as well. The handrails and the baffles up there and the geometry of the stairs.
It's just this glass sleeve between the new and the old, and then you get this orientation back towards the main part of the building. That's awesome.
So, to summarize, clearly identifying the problem is really how it led to a resolution. Wholeness accurately describes the dynamic reality. Everything is process, and process is everything. Transparency of the process pays multiple dividends. Collaboration is the social version of wholeness. Listen and get the hell out of the way. And there you have it. So thank you all for enduring my talk. If you have any questions, I'd be honored to try to answer them.
Early backlighting, there was a comment about tie up your camera.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
So it's a two-part thing in there, and part of it was the car, and how do you store the car? And then the other part of it is rethinking and honoring that the car actually had a historic meaning, because Frank Lloyd Wright had a very intentional method of thinking of how the car entered the site. So that was part of that resolution.
Is it completed now?
It is completed, yes.
Tour it?
You can. They have probably per year, that church gets close to 4,500 visitors worldwide. So it's one of the more popular places of Frank Lloyd Wright buildings in the Madison area.
How many does it hold?
The auditorium seats 1,400, so they have, it took it and tripled their size of what they were able to seat. Services, multiple times. They had to initially turn people away because there was not enough seating. That's how much of a demand they had in that area. So they were able to continue to be able to meet their demand.
But the original sanctuary.
Original sanctuary stays. They have the smaller venue, the larger venue, and that allows them to be able to accommodate a number of different event sizes. Yes?
Being so talented as in the realm of process-driven design, it's a very particular skill set and a real niche probably for your firm. And this project really allowed you to indulge that muscle. But do you find you've got the opportunity to flex that pretty regularly, or does that end up becoming a skill set that hampers the firm at times?
Our clients, whether they ask for it or not, they get it. Sometimes we mask it because they don't maybe understand why we're doing what we're doing, but that process makes it so much easier to design, because if you fully understand the problem, the design always can get measured with how successful is it, did it answer all of the patterns that were written early on. And then it's not ego-driven, it's not fashion-driven, it's not all these other things that are probably not as important as really fully understanding what the issues are that design needs to solve. So it's kind of, it's there. That's just how we design.
All right. So I'm Jonathan Beck. I'm with the Alexander Company, also a board member of the Wisconsin Trust for Historic Preservation. Worked with Matt very closely on getting a state historic tax credit for Wisconsin, and then working on numerous studies with the Historic Preservation Institute, both in 2015 and 2017, studying the economic impact of the program and sitting with Wisconsin Fiscal Bureau pretty regularly and meeting with legislators in order to make sure that this program stuck around and we were able to do great projects in Wisconsin. Just want to make sure, can everybody hear me? I'm going to be trying to talk super loud, given that not really mic'd, so just yell at me to speak up. But first I wanted to say, grew up in Wisconsin, and a big fan of Frank Lloyd Wright. My first real exposure to him is I used to go down to the public library and rent films and documentaries, and I rented an interview that he did with Mike Wallace when I was 14 years old that was really inspiring. And I was kind of thinking back on that as we're talking about sacred places, and as Wallace asked him, what he thought about church architecture. And I know that we're talking quite a bit about churches, and he always said it was a great shame, with what church architecture was like in his day, and that he put a capital N on nature and called it his church. And so I think that it's, I think that it's interesting that we're talking about church architecture in his drafting room. But this is a project that I've more or less been involved with numerous other people, a lot of folks in this room, including Dinah and Mark, who are in here. Matt has been involved with this. But this is, a real, iconic project for Wisconsin that a lot of advocates, a lot of historic preservationists wanted to see saved over the decades. I went to school for real estate and urban land economics. I graduated in 2000 and worked for the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and started my career with the really being one of the first hires for their for-profit subsidiary called the National Trust Community Investment Corp. And we used to invest in very complex tax credit projects, both historic and new markets, tax credit developments throughout the United States, and really got to see how some really complex financing was put together. And when I came back to Wisconsin in 2004, I first set, foot on this campus that was already having quite a bit of talk about what's going to happen to this. These iconic structures, including the old main building, the Ward Memorial Theater that was built in 1881, and then also the chapel. So that I'll talk about that in another later towards the end. But this first phase of the development, we responded to an RFP in 2016 to take on with the Housing Authority of the City of Milwaukee to redevelop 6 buildings into 101 units of housing for veterans at risk of homelessness. But the story really started, prior to that in 2010 when the roof of Old Main collapsed. And the state and the National Trust and the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation and Milwaukee Preservation Alliance all started really tough conversations with the VA, saying they're in violation of Section 106 of, they couldn't just let these buildings that were really seen as the birthplace of veterans care in the United States just collapse. The taxpayers paid for these at one point in time, and if they didn't really have a use for them anymore, they had to figure out a use. And so the Community Advisory Council then was created in 2011. The properties were posted on the 11 most endangered list by the National Trust in 2011. And these really tough conversations started going back and forth, how to reuse these buildings. And the Veterans Administration at the point was more focused on traumatic brain injury, say, than really restoring architecture. But we knew that there were different economic development tools that we could use in order to bring these buildings back. But I'm just going to kind of show you some buildings, from back in the day. The campus was really created right at the end of the Civil War. The women of Milwaukee were raising funds at that point in time to create, homes for veterans that were living on the street that came back injured And they held this fair in 1865, raised $110,000, and at the same point in time, the federal government was trying to figure out a solution to care for the veterans, and Lincoln's last act was to sign into a system of care. When that legislation was signed, powerful folks in Wisconsin convinced the women of Milwaukee to send that money that they raised over to the federal government, purchase 400 acres, and really start building. So Milwaukee was one of the first 3 soldier homes in the country because of those women. And this first building, Old Main, was constructed between 1867 and opened its doors in 1869 with various additions. This is kind of an overhead view of the historic components of the campus. And if any of you are familiar with like American Family Field or Miller Park or County Stadium, whatever you want to call it, that was also once on the original soldier home grounds. And also when I refer to soldier homes eventually in 1930, that became really folded in and became really the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs. So here's a historic lithograph to show you what Old Main would have looked like on these grounds at a point in time in Milwaukee. Here's a photograph of that soldier home fair. And then, Lincoln's comments on, creating that system: let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and within all nations. Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural address. This is not quite the condition. It was much worse when we took on Old Main, and I'll show you these other buildings as well. But really, in 1989, this building had not been used until we opened the doors in 2021. So here's some historic photographs. You once had, about 1,000 men living in these, in various barracks, and you had dining rooms, and it was, Old Main was really used for multiple functions as then they built out then the campus and other buildings, but this was the first. So the uses that we got when in 2014, so 2011, Community Advisory Council is formed. In 2014, the United States Department of Veterans Affairs just started to put out a request for qualifications. And they wanted to see if developers were even interested in taking on these structures. And we had responded to that request. And at this time, a lot of folks might be familiar with the Historic American Building Survey, or the HABS program. I had reached out to Park Service knowing that eventually a request for proposal would come out. And generally they give you about 3 weeks to do one of those, to really come up with a really tough plan. And so I knew that there was a HABS study that was done on Old Main that was with the Library of Congress. It's a joint program between Library of Congress and Park Service. And so I asked for the AutoCAD files. And so they had never received a request like that, but they're like, why do you want these? And I kind of explained what was going on in Milwaukee and with the advocacy. And so they took about 10 minutes to think it over, and they're like, yeah, let's send these guys the AutoCAD files. And so we were able to start working through and laying out how the building could be used for today. So we had a little bit of a head start before any of the other developers by reaching out for that public request. So if you guys are ever working on some really iconic federal surplus property, maybe there's a HABS study on it, try to get the AutoCADs and save yourself $500,000 in design, because the drawings are phenomenal that they do. Right before working at the National Trust then, I was a low-income housing tax credit investor. And I knew that while the preservationists really cared what was being done, this was also going to be an affordable housing development for veterans at risk of homelessness. And we would have to figure out how to use that Section 42 program. Our tax credit investor was a group called National Equity Fund. They do a lot of veteran housing in the United States and a lot of supportive housing. And so Debbie Burkhart was a very key person at this point who is also meeting with the VA in addition to the preservationists. Often the preservationists will always pat themselves on the back as the ones that made it happen, but it was also the affordable housing professionals that had regular contact with the VA, and they said, hey, are you watching what's going on in Milwaukee? You got some great buildings that can be reutilized to get people off the streets and have them on the VA campus getting supportive services. So we put together a capital stack that was about $45 million to do these first 101 units in 6 buildings. So the federal historic tax or low income equity was $20 million on a $45 million project. So you can see like how that tool was very key. The federal historic tax credit was $7 million. And then we had the state historic tax credit, $6.7 million. Without the state historic tax credit on this would have never come to fruition. And I remember when the program would come to threat, in 15 and 17, Dinah would give me a call, where are you at with the VA right now? Because without this, economic tool, this project doesn't happen. So right when we were getting ready to, start construction and things were going really well, tax reform happened, and we went from a 38% corporate tax rate to a 21%. This knocked the value of all these credits down quite a bit because our lease yet wasn't signed by Congress. And we had a big gap because of the pricing in there, and we were able then to get military construction funding, which we were told was kind of diverted from wall money at the time. So that was one of the most unique components in the capital stack. And then we got Federal Home Loan Bank awards, we did National Housing Trust Fund loans, Home Depot Foundation dollars for $500,000, National Park Service Save America Treasures grants of $500,000, the City of Milwaukee kicked in, LISC, which is the parent corporation of the National Equity Fund, WIDA Capital Magnet Funds, and then we layered in around $3.5 million of capital campaign dollars. So we worked with the Greater Milwaukee Foundation and Milwaukee Preservation Alliance to get dollars in for that $45 million. And then we also had to get what are called VASH vouchers. So once the property was constructed, most of the veterans living here, they don't have enough income to keep the lights on. So there's a program called the Section 8 program where an individual will put in 30% of their income and HUD kicks in the other 70%. If that individual has no income, HUD picks up the total dollar, but it's to help chronically homeless. And the VASH program is a Section 8 program in partnership with the VA where they also provide services, and it's for honorably discharged veterans that are experiencing chronic homelessness. And for every 20 vouchers, you have a case manager that meets regularly with them. It took me 3 years to get the 101 VASH vouchers in order to keep the lights on this. And whenever we were working with WIDA at the time to come up with certain exceptions that we needed on this, they're always like, hey, we don't want to divert at all ever, from our program, because then another developer can come in and ask for an exception. But it's like, when are you going to ever have a Lincoln Commission building that's a National Historic Landmark that is supporting veterans? And when they would have to think about it, we'd be like, you're going to lose the VASH vouchers, and those will go to California. And so there was a lot of people watching this and a lot of exceptions made by the WIDA board to see this through. But basically, what we did is a long-term lease from the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, and then we had 2 condominium structures, and we used 2 different types of low-income housing tax credits to make this project come to fruition. And again, a partnership between the Alexander Company, where we put together the financing, took the construction risk, oversaw the design, and then we were to pass it over to the Housing Authority of the City of Milwaukee. During the recession, this is just a side, that the Housing Authority of the City of Milwaukee basically fell apart, and now we're managing this. So, so now we're doing kind of everything, but Housing Authority is administering still the VASH vouchers and helping us get residents in. Very complex tax pieces, but this is one of those projects that, fortunately, we don't get a lot of no's on. The New York Times ended up doing a really nice piece in 2017, the Washington Post. They gave really flattering shots of my fanny, like walking up ladders. And so, anyway, WIDA would make the exceptions. National Park Service would help us with the SAT grants, usher those through. The State Historic Preservation Office and National Historic Landmarks were great working through. And, you know, it ended up really becoming quite a success story. Here's some of the details of those HABS drawings that you can see. And so we worked with Ramlo Stein on the old main building, and then we did the architectural work in-house for the other 5 buildings. But they were able to use the HABS drawings and incorporate them in. This was the groundbreaking. You can see, you know, Tony Evers was talking at that point in time, and you really had Tammy Baldwin and Senator Ron Johnson's staff really, this is one of those ones that everybody could agree on, that we needed to do something with this property. Some of the construction more interesting, you know, we had about 600 windows that needed to be fully restored. We were lucky that they were all intact. Our contractor was J.P. Cullen on this. They ended up, you know, really disassembling everything and then redoing all the windows, all the reglazing, all on site. This is what the scaffolding looked like during the pandemic. So we had the entire building scaffolded. We ended up doing slate roofs. We ended up sourcing the same slate that was originally there from a quarry in Vermont. Ended up doing all the new copper roof, all the tuck pointing. And then where that big dining hall is, that's where a lot of the supportive offices are, a lot of the community rooms, the workforce training rooms. And so we worked with the Park Service on that in order to make sure that space was respectfully dedicated. You can see all the plaster repair work. The detail that was put back into the plaster was really incredible. It had this block printing that you won't be able to actually see in these photographs, but really a nice job on bringing all of that back. And so then this was really the final result of just, you know, a beautiful structure. We did interior storms on this, and we moved we got certificate of occupancy on March 10th, and we moved our first veteran residence in March 12th of 2021. We were still working through our lead wipe tests for HUD on this. Well, we had a lot of residents scheduled for March 1st. We put them up in motels, and I took all their stuff personally and brought it up to their rooms until the lead sampling was done. And so, I mean, like, we were extremely hands-on in this project, to say the least. We worked closely with the Wisconsin Veterans Museum. Yvette Pino was the curator. We worked on about 200 pieces of artwork from various conflicts that were all very sensitive in the way that they were represented in order not to trigger any, you know, negative emotional response for any of the veterans living there. This is a typical unit. Community room, we still had 3 pool tables from about World War II. We combined those and built one really nice table and put that in the community room for the residents. You know, we had an old loom in there, and we have a little history center that's open. And then the War Memorial we made a good relationship with over the time, and they had all these really great World War I and World War II recruitment posters that we went on, we got them on permanent exhibit, so we keep those insured, and hopefully those will change over now and then. We had 2 women's wings that were just for women that we added an extra layer of security. It was something that we noticed on other veteran projects because we really did not want this to be a male-only facility. These are some of, you know, the really beautiful spaces up on the tower lounges. We gave a lot of different naming rights for these, but for a lot of the veterans, you know, to come up here and have like a cup of coffee or something, this is just a really great place to enjoy. Here's the detail of the roof. Here's the admin building. This is 14 single-room occupant units, and the old main was 80 units, what we got in there. So it's 71 bedroom units, 10 two-bedroom units. This is 14 SRO units. So this was once they had the original post office, so this is the dining area. We restored all the original doors, the original tin walls, and what was the postmaster office. But this is one of the many lounge rooms. And then we had these officer housing. These are side-by-side duplexes. These are 3-bedroom units. We cleaned these up, and so these are extremely nice family units with nice fireplaces, big attics, and basements for them. And then we restored the Catholic chaplain's house into a 4-bedroom unit. Their naming wall. And then some of the awards that we got on this, the most notable one was the Richard Driehaus Foundation Award from the National Trust in 2021, and also the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, HUD Secretary's Award for reuse of federal property. But the ACHP oversees every federal agency and their properties that were created in 1966. But a lot of affordable housing stuff that you guys won't care about. But anywho, so after that was done, a lot of people kept on asking us, well, what about Ward Memorial Theater? What about the chapel? What about, this governor's mansion? And it's just like, let somebody else have some fun with those. I can't take all this glory, because we knew that this was always going to be the toughest. And starting in 2007, 2008, 9, there was a nonprofit that was put together with some politicians, and they were trying to raise some funds, and they got an SAT award, and they were making some traction on that chapel. And I talked to them a number of times, but they didn't really have an operational plan. They didn't have people living on the campus yet. And I always thought, let's get the housing components done first, and then figure out, the social services that then can then assist those that are living there. But Ward Memorial Theater, I don't know if any of you know about this. You even have a picture of Ulysses S. Grant on his horse. This was the first building to be placed on the National Register for the complex, or the district. And it was placed in 1984, and there was a real effort to try to save the theater then, and even Liberace had gotten involved, given that he'd grown up on National Avenue, learned how to play, or was teaching or performing for veterans at that time, was going to potentially make a donation. But, it never really came to fruition. And then this is the chapel building. This was built in 1889. And then there's a governor's mansion too that I'll show you some pictures of. But in 2021, and Miller Dunwoody is also here in the audience, and the National Trust ended up giving some dollars to Milwaukee Preservation Alliance in order to figure out, well, what can we do now with these other buildings that are realistic, that we can show to the VA so that they can have a study that's done. So MPA, ended up putting out an RFP, and then I said, look, we care what happens to the rest of the campus. We're not going to do the project, but I've worked on a number of theater projects, and know the campus in and out pretty well. And Miller Dunwoody, who had a lot of experience with theaters, did some layouts. And then J.P. Cullen, who was the contractor, had done some pricing exercises on the buildings. And so they also, worked pro bono on this in order to really look at what could be done. So we did a financial feasibility study and presented it in 2021. And it kind of more or less piqued some interest. The VA asked again, hey, do you want to do this project? And at the time, it was showing about a $15 to $20 million fundraising need. And I knew how hard it was to raise about $3 million for that first phase. And I knew that all of the other programs for the affordable housing weren't going to be there. So it's like, yeah, let's let somebody else have fun with this one. So, we still kind of took a pass on it. But this was, the study. And, we had the Al Ringling Theater and showed how there was a capital campaign required, like a lot of theater projects. And, came up with this, big picture, but it was always the capital campaign was going to be a real nightmare on it, and who was going to operate this? We do a lot of housing development, we do a lot of commercial development, but we're not really in the business of, operating churches and theaters. And so I'm just kind of flipping through this. Oh, and here's that cool governor's mansion. And, we laid out what some potential uses could be. J.P. Cullen laid out what the pricing could be on this. We put out a pro forma, and at the time we're looking around 22 to $25 million. Tax credits could help, but again, it wasn't going to really move the needle. So in 2022, at the end, November, there was an attorney named Richard Green that worked for the VA, and he remembered this study that was done. And he said, John, are you familiar with the PACT Act? And so it was just a call out of the blue as I was driving to work, and I said, I am. That's for legislation that was for veterans that were exposed to toxic burn pits. And he said, yeah, but in that legislation, there's $933 million available for doing more housing and social services on VA campuses to be gap filler for private developers coming through. On that study, how much did you say that you needed? And I said about 15 million. They said, well, of the 933 million, we still have 300 million left. I bet you, with the work that you did on the first phase, would you be interested in doing the project? Okay, yeah. So as long as I don't have to spend my entire time doing fundraising, that would be great. So not quite so easy then. It took from November of 2022 until February of this year to really put together the right partnership with Center for Veterans Issues, who's the largest veteran service organization, that they were going to be our joint venture partner. They were going to take the mansion to do a number of their SSVF program and workforce training programs. And then we were going to somehow work on the theater and the chapel to do veteran programming with groups like Feast of Crispian that does, veteran performances with PTSD vets and have different counseling services and weddings and burials again at the chapel. So, we really worked to convince the case, and we were drilled pretty hard because this was going to be the first money out of the PACT Act dollars. And so there was a lot of writing back and forth starting, in May, where they would just ask us everything, lay out what the partners are, the type of work that we've done, who Center for Veterans Issues are. And they wanted to keep on drilling all the benefits that were going to be provided veterans. It wasn't just to restore pretty buildings. This is to really provide services, for the veterans living on the campus in the Milwaukee area and then the entire state. So finally, we had a public hearing. We had to apply, though, really quick for SAT dollars by December. And the VA allowed us, they knew that they were getting close with us, so they signed off and allowed the group to apply for Save America Treasures dollars. We were able to get 2 awards, one for the Governor's Mansion and one for the chapel. I was just talking with Mark Beekle, how come we didn't get one for the Ward Memorial? We think that only, any group can only get 2, we're guessing. But a lot of senior leadership questions on this. So I'm just kind of showing you the behind the scene, constant write-ups with the VA attorneys and with the OAEM staff until finally, it was to come together. The budgets went up a little bit, but they agreed to give us, the 15 million in order to make this development work. Right now, where we're at with this, construction numbers have gone up a little bit, but we, hold on, let me just get to the end here. Lots of letters of support. Oh wait, yeah, we even got one from the Manitowoc Minute, Charlie Barons. But yeah, we had to get a lot of support letters and everything. But on this, where we're at right now, we're still working on the design on this. We did get the HABS drawings on this, but there was a lot of back and forth on how do you use this theater. You have an upper balcony with some serious ADA issues, and how are you going to keep this filled? But where we're at right now is we have an agreement, an exclusivity with Pabst Theater Group, and the Pabst Group, they've done a nice job with the Pabst Theater, which is a National Historic Landmark, the Riverside, Turner Hall, 3 other theater groups. And so we're talking with Gary Witt and have been, and he said, why wouldn't you have talked with us on this? Gary has got a number of children that served in the military and had even some more ideas, really how to honor veterans, how to set up a little surcharge at the tickets for the maintenance fund, really how to call attention for every performance really to veterans issues and really on the acoustics on this. So the theater is extremely complicated where you could throw an architect at it and you're like, hey, design me an amazing space that really doesn't function well. So we finally came to the conclusion we do have to have that upper balcony done, and so we're working through that right now. And so Pabst, they're going to work with both the chapel as an operator and then also the theater, while CVI primarily focuses their services out of the mansion. These are just some of the different groups that were interested. This is the Feast of Crispian group, though, but that's a great organization to have on the theater project. But yeah, this thing is all like coming together. But we'll use the federal and state historic tax credit equity. We'll use Save America's treasures, maybe some WDC grants, capital campaign of a small amount. There's still been some donors that have been giving in. And we don't have our lease signed, but we're doing stabilization of the chapel roof now. That's really open to the elements. The big cupola blew off of it, and it's in need of some stabilization right now. So we're going to be using some of those campaign dollars in order to do the tarping and everything, so it does last another winter. I was a little bit scared in order to do that. I had gotten a call from MPA, Milwaukee Preservation Alliance, that said, "Hey, John, we got a first heavy snow." And whenever they call, I'm like, what happened? What burned down? What broke? You know, what terrible thing. My heart always skips a beat when I get phone calls on a Saturday, like at 9 a.m. from them. But we don't want to risk it. And we did the same thing with Old Main. Before our lease was actually signed and we had the financing all closed, we were like, let's not create any more damage through the winter, because when a building's open to the elements like this, it starts going fast. And so I'm glad that we have that resource in order to get that. We'll start the work next week on that stabilization. These are some income and expenses that we were guessing on, but now we're like fine tuning the budgets on all of this. Cullen's still like working on this. But in the meantime, when we're working on this, I just want to tell you, so CVI, we got talked into doing 81 units of additional housing. This is over on Wells and 35th, so this closed this summer. So once you kind of like learn how to do these veterans projects, you'd be amazed at how many more of these you're going to probably be doing like the rest of your life. And I always swear it's going to be the last one until it's not. So this closed on financing on August 27th, but CVI, again, they're a joint venture partner. We couldn't take on these projects, the theater, the chapel, and the ward, without them, and they couldn't have taken on this project without us. So this is a real nice partnership that we've developed with a veteran service organization. So on a lot of what's being talked about today, and we'll talk about this a little more at 4 o'clock, there's a lot of nonprofits that own these sacred places, and there's lots of good partnerships that can be created with for-profit entities. And nonprofits can use the federal historic tax credit. There's all sorts of what are called disqualified lease rules. We'll go through some of those at 4 o'clock. But CVI, they're going to be a nonprofit partner in those other buildings, and they're the nonprofit in these buildings with low-income housing tax credit investors. So always remember that nonprofits can tap into these programs as long as you're following certain rules. And that's just something that I think a lot of religious organizations think that they might not be able to tap into, but they actually are. And even if they're going to continue to use the building as the church, let's say that that's on Sundays, they can do something with that facility Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, have different programming coming. And as long as they have 50% of new uses, they will not come up against what are called the disqualified lease rules. So a lot of these organizations that might be struggling with how to keep the lights on, well, don't have a building sitting empty, like 5 days of the week. Try to figure out how to have other groups in there, other users in there, and create some more revenue coming in. So again, this is what the Vets Place Central deal looks like, and I think I'm going to stop. So, any questions?
Such an easy project.
Yeah.
I don't know what the big deal is. I think we went 15, 20 years ago and we talked about this and you said housing for veterans. Okay, get it done.
Yeah.
What's the big deal here?
Yeah.
But what an interesting and complicated matrix he had at the beginning. Remember that second or third slide? Unbelievable. But John and the Alexander Company, they are the go-to company, not just in Wisconsin, but nationally, for getting things like this done. And you can see through this presentation how impressive and great it is. John.
John, I've gotten to know you, and you can find money anywhere. It doesn't matter what the project is. I've seen it. He can
Yeah.
find money anywhere.
Yep, yep.
How, the 15 million,
Yeah.
you this last one, that's a big one.
Yeah.
How did you run into this knowledge about the 15 million?
Oh, so I mean, this is, I mean, there's always good timing on these things. Old Main would not have been able to be done without the state historic tax credit. People were advocating for it in 2011. It could have gone to like a private developer. They would have never been able to like get it done. It would have got knocked over. In 2017, when we came up against tax reform, they allowed us to do what was called a hybrid structure and combine these 9% and 4% tax credits and to use our excess tax basis to generate 4% credits. That tax reform was actually a godsend that we both got military construction funding and allowed to do a hybrid structure. The chapel would have never been able to get done. The theater would have never been able to get done without these PACT fund dollars. And that happened to pass in 2022. And so we were in the right place at the right time in order to do that. And you know, that study also helped, but it was on the VA's radar, but that they had put in $933 million, I didn't know that. Somebody had to bring that to my attention. An attorney had to give me a call up and tell me exactly how much they actually had left, you know, 300 million. But if we didn't do the first buildings, we would not have had the track record or the trust by the federal government in order to do it. So if we came in cold and said we could do it, it was like pulling teeth, you know, getting to commitment and getting to the public hearing like point for that 15 million. And they're all watching it very closely that it's the first money out. So divine intervention. So, yeah.
I just want to say, if you need money, go talk to John.
Yeah. So.
Matter of fact, yeah, let's check.
Do you see the presidential election coming up as having any effect on historic preservation efforts or laws, et cetera?
You know, it's tough to say. You know, both administrations, like indirectly, I think, helped. You know, but I think you got to talk to Mark on that one. You know, but I don't want to put him on the spot.
One of the really good things about preservation is it tends to be somewhat bipartisan. We have both Democrats and Republicans who support preservation. So there's always a chance for a budget issue. You get a 30% cut. It's going to impact things like you mentioned SAT grants. The last 2 years of this current administration, we had $26.5 million, of which you got a couple from. The next one, which grants are due December 20th, if you own an NHL and want to apply, we have like $25 million. But in the past administration, that number was always 14 million, 12 million, so we got like 10 million more. And so even though you get support, sometimes the funding level can change. But as a general rule, we're not nearly as partisan of a issue. We have strong support from, so I don't think anything will go away. The numbers might change depending on the economic climate, but there's broad support from both parties on most preservation issues.
Right, and I'll say, like, while the tax credits help, bank interest rates don't, inflation doesn't. So, I mean, a lot of the National Park Service is actually taking quite a bit of heat right now that preservation projects are down. But preservation projects are also down because they're just so expensive to do. They're so complex to do. And again, interest rates and inflation and banks willing to lend, it's almost impossible to get a bank loan right now. The one I closed on August 27th, around August 19th, I said, I'm done with this. You know, like, I mean, just the amount of, it's almost as if they're trying not to lend because of what's on the horizon in the commercial real estate market because of what's happened during the pandemic and working from home and what's going to happen with the office market and the exposure that they have there. So, I mean, it's really tough. There's so many different things at play. So.